Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. They did not kick me out with screams. They did it with smiles, new locks, and the polite disgust the wealthy reserve for an orphan staining their legacy. 6 days after the general who raised me was buried, they sat in the lawyer's office dressed like victors, waiting to hear my existence legally erased. But old soldiers never enter their final battle without burying landmines under the greedy. In this room, the last page is the gunshot. My name is Harper Baker. Exactly 6 days have passed since the dirt settled over General Warren Holloway's casket, and already the vultures are circling the polished mahogany conference table. I stepped into the reception area of Malcolm Sir's law firm in downtown Savannah precisely at 3:00 in the afternoon. The oppressive, heavy humidity of the Georgia summer vanished the second the thick glass doors sealed behind me, instantly replaced by the aggressively refrigerated air of corporate inheritance and quiet power. I wore a simple dark suit, the kind you buy off the rack when your priority is blending into the shadows rather than owning the room. In my right hand, I carried a scuffed brown leather suitcase. It held nothing of immense monetary value. It contained only the few personal artifacts I had managed to salvage from my own bedroom before the new deadbolts clicked into place. My face remained an unreadable, hardened mask. Panic and grief were expensive luxuries I could no longer afford. The conference room felt less like a legal setting and more like a designated kill zone. Evelyn Holloway, the general's biological sister, anchored the far end of the long table. She sat with the rigid, perfectly aligned spine of a bygone Southern matriarch, her pale hands folded firmly over a vintage silk purse. She smelled of expensive floral perfume, mothballs, and old money. To her right sat Grant Holloway, Warren's nephew, projecting the restless, vibrating energy of a man who had mentally spent his inheritance 3 years ago. Beside him was his wife, Camille, poised and predatory. The moment I crossed the threshold and let the heavy oak door click shut behind me, all 3 pairs of eyes snapped toward me in perfect unison. They looked at me not as a grieving daughter, not as someone who had spent the last 2 years changing the general's oxygen tanks and managing his pain charts, but as the absolute worst humanitarian mistake Warren Holloway had ever made during his 75 years on Earth. To them, I was a stray dog that had somehow wandered onto their pristine manicured lawn. Camille fired the first shot. She leaned back in her plush leather executive chair, her gaze dropping deliberately to the worn edges of my suitcase. Her smile was a masterclass in polite, refined cruelty. "I see you brought your luggage, Harper," Camille said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that coated the room like poison. "That is incredibly practical of you. You really should learn to pack light moving forward. The Holloway estate is a historic legacy, after all. It was never intended to be a permanent relief camp for strays and strangers. I am sure you understand the necessity of wrapping up these loose ends." I did not break my stride. I walked the length of the room and pulled out the chair furthest from their united front. The leather creaked under my weight. Grant offered a dry, dismissive chuckle, lifting a hand to adjust his bespoke silk tie. He leaned forward, resting his tailored forearms on the polished mahogany. "Camille is right," Grant added, his tone masquerading as gentle, paternal advice while hiding a serrated edge. "You had a good run, Harper. Uncle Warren gave you a roof, a private education, and a lifestyle you could never have dreamed of otherwise. You should walk out of here today on your knees with immense gratitude. Just do not confuse a charitable upbringing with a permanent invitation to the family registry. It is time to let the adults handle the estate. You do not have the right to sit at the table with real blood." Real blood. The 2 words hung in the sterile, chill air, heavy with entitlement and generational arrogance. I did not respond. I did not flinch. I did not cry. And I certainly did not defend myself. I simply sat down, placed my 2 feet flat on the carpeted floor, and rested my hands perfectly still upon my knees. I looked directly at Grant, holding his gaze until he blinked, then shifted my eyes to Camille, and finally to Evelyn. The silence stretched. 10 seconds passed, then 20 seconds, then 30 seconds. I learned a very long time ago that people who use words as weapons absolutely despise the quiet. When you do not react, their aggression has nowhere to land. It bounces back, making them feel exposed, clumsy, and small. I watched the smugness on Grant's face twitch. Camille shifted uncomfortably in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, suddenly hyper-aware of the suffocating silence filling the room. Even Evelyn's iron posture seemed to stiffen further under the weight of my absolute refusal to engage in their petty warfare. At the head of the table, Attorney Malcolm Sir observed the entire exchange without blinking. He was a man who had spent 40 years untangling the bitter, greedy messes that dead people left behind. He did not open the thick manila folders sitting in front of him right away. Instead, he let the silence brew and simmer. He looked at Evelyn, then at Grant, then at Camille, and finally at me. His gaze was heavy and tired, the look of a man entirely accustomed to watching respectable families enthusiastically rip off their own masks the second the smell of money entered the room. Malcolm's wrinkled hands rested over a large rectangular archival box. Inside that box, resting atop the standard legal pads and printed testaments, was a heavy black leather document tube. It was thick, archaic, and heavily sealed at both ends, with dark green wax bearing the distinct imprint of Warren's personal signet ring. Grant caught sight of the leather tube and dismissed it with a quiet, arrogant scoff. He leaned over to Camille and whispered, though his voice was perfectly audible in the dead quiet of the room. Probably just the old man's land surveys for the Marsh properties or some outdated tax addendums. Nothing that slows down the transfer of the primary accounts. Malcolm Sir cleared his throat. The low sound commanded immediate, absolute authority. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and slowly unclasped the leather strap of his primary folder. "Good afternoon," Malcolm said, his voice a low, growly baritone that left no room for interruption or side commentary. "We are gathered here today to execute the final wishes of General Warren Holloway. I must inform all parties present that the General was extremely meticulous in his final months. Therefore, this reading will not be as brief as you might expect." That single sentence, "not as brief as you might expect," sent a microscopic ripple of electricity straight down my spine. I kept my face blank, holding my breath for a fraction of a second, but my mind sharpened into extreme focus. I knew Warren. I knew his military discipline, his strategic foresight, and his absolute refusal to leave loose ends on any battlefield. The Holloway trio, however, heard the exact opposite. Their greed filtered the lawyer's words into a completely different language. They interpreted Malcolm's warning as the preamble to a lengthy, tedious, and glorious listing of their vast new wealth. Grant's chest puffed out a fraction of an inch against his fitted vest. Evelyn nodded with grave, solemn approval, as if graciously accepting a heavy crown. Camille turned her head toward me one last time. The triumphant, malicious gleam in her dark eyes was absolutely blinding. She believed the game was already over. She believed she was sitting on the winning side of the board, waiting for the referee to blow the final whistle. "Well," Camille whispered softly, aiming the sharp words squarely at my chest, "at least you will be leaving here much lighter, Harper. The terrible burden of pretending you actually belong here is finally over." She smiled. It was the wide, confident smile of someone who had never had the solid ground violently ripped out from beneath her feet. I stared at her perfectly manicured hands, at the enormous diamond ring catching the harsh fluorescent light above us, and the sterile walls of the law office seemed to completely dissolve around me. The smell of expensive perfume and polished leather faded away, replaced instantly by the suffocating metallic stench of wet asphalt, spilled gasoline, and torrential rain. Camille's arrogant face vanished. In its place, I saw the blinding flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles cutting through the absolute darkness of a hurricane-battered highway. They thought my story with Warren Holloway began with charity. They thought it began with a rich man's pity. They did not understand that to know why the General left the ultimate landmine buried directly under their feet, you had to understand how a seasoned soldier recognizes a true survivor. You had to go back to the roaring winds, the shattered glass, and the horrific night my entire world was ripped apart in a split second. Back to the exact moment a terrified 11-year-old orphan pulled herself from the wreckage, and an old general decided to teach her exactly how to stand up and fight back. The rain did not fall that night. It drove sideways like nails, shot from a steel gun. I was 11 years old when the coastal evacuation orders came down across the Alabama shoreline. A massive hurricane was chewing its way through the Gulf, and the interstate was a choked artery of panicked people fleeing the wrath of the sky. We were in a battered sedan, moving a miserable crawl until a transport truck hydroplaned 3 cars ahead of us. The pileup involved 14 vehicles. My parents died instantly in the crushing impact of twisted metal and shattered glass. By morning, the storm made landfall and washed away half the county. The local news stations were so overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the property damage and the rising flood waters that the highway collision warranted barely 45 seconds of airtime. My mother and father became a tragic, aimless footnote in a broader weather report. I became a ward of the state. There were no grandparents waiting in the wings. There were no arranged aunts or distant cousins willing to take in a quiet, shell-shocked child. The system stepped in with its sterile offices, its overworked social workers, and its endless piles of beige folders. Over the next 4 years, I was cycled rapidly through the foster network. I learned very early that a house is merely a physical structure, not a home. I stayed in 6 different places in a span of 48 months. In some of these houses, I was fed well and given a warm bed. In others, I was treated like a mandatory chore. I belonged nowhere. You learn to read adult faces with terrifying accuracy when your daily survival depends entirely on it. I could tell within the first 10 minutes of walking through a new front door exactly what kind of foster parents I had drawn from the state lottery. There were the genuinely kind ones, well-meaning but utterly exhausted by a broken bureaucracy. There were the dutiful ones driven by a rigid sense of religious obligation who saw me as a charity project rather than a breathing human being. And then there were the financial ones, the couples who looked at me and mentally calculated the exact dollar amount of the monthly reimbursement check. To them, I was a utility bill paid in advance by the government. Because of this constant displacement, I became what social workers approvingly called mature for my age. It is a terrible compliment to give a child. It simply means you do not demand things. You do not cry loudly. You do not believe a single promise anyone makes. And you certainly never unpack your suitcase completely. I kept my clothes rolled tight. I kept my shoes near the door. I knew I could be relocated with a warning of only 24 hours, so I lived like a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's families without ever leaving a footprint. The absolute turning point of my life happened when I was 15 years old. Another hurricane had battered the Gulf Coast, this time hammering Mobile. The foster family I was staying with belonged to a massive community church that loved highly visible volunteer work. They dragged me along to a colossal relief supply warehouse near the shipping docks. The building was a cavernous, echoing concrete box filled with hundreds of volunteers, roaring forklifts, and towering pallets of emergency supplies. Various veteran organizations were running the logistics, attempting to impose strict military order on raw civilian chaos. I was assigned to sit in a folding chair near the central dispatch wall and stay out of the way. For 2 solid hours, I simply sat and watched. I watched the frantic clipboard holders running back and forth. I watched the dry erase boards being updated with colored markers. And because I had spent my entire life silently observing how broken systems operate, I noticed a catastrophic flaw. A massive logistical chart mapped out the routing for the afternoon. Someone had transposed a set of critical numbers. 2 heavy flatbed trucks loaded with industrial generators, water filtration kits, and medical supplies were scheduled to be dispatched to Sector 9. But Sector 9 was a coastal depression area completely submerged under 5 feet of toxic flood water. The actual staging ground for the medical triage was Sector 6. If those trucks left the dock under the current orders, they would hit a flooded roadblock, and the supplies would sit uselessly on a wet highway. While the triage center ran out of power and medicine, I stood up from my folding chair and walked directly over to the dispatch board. I did not intend to be a hero. I just hated the profound inefficiency of it all. I reached for a red marker sitting on the aluminum ledge, fully intending to correct the routing number myself. A shadow fell over me before I could even uncap the pen. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" "Young lady." The voice was not loud, but it possessed a dense physical weight that made the chaotic noise of the warehouse seem to instantly drop away. I turned around. Standing behind me was a man in a crisp utility shirt and faded tactical trousers. His hair was iron gray, cut close to his scalp. His posture was terrifyingly straight. He did not look like a weekend volunteer. He looked like the man who owned the war. This was General Warren Holloway, retired Army Logistics Command. I did not know his impressive title at the exact moment. I only knew he had the sharpest, coldest blue eyes I had ever seen in my life. Most adults in that situation would have snatched the marker out of my hand, patted me on the head, and told me to go find my chaperone. Warren Holloway did no such thing. He looked at the marker, looked at the board, and then looked directly into my eyes, assessing me not as a lost child, but as a subordinate who had just stepped out of formation. He asked me 3 rapid-fire questions, his tone flat, even, and intensely demanding. Where is the tactical error? How do you intend to fix it? And why are you the only one in a room of 200 adults trying to touch my board instead of staying quiet like the other kids? I did not shrink back. The foster system had burned the instinct of fearful intimidation out of me years ago. I pointed cleanly at the board. "The supply load for Sector 6 is routed to Sector 9, I said, my voice remarkably steady. "Sector 9 is underwater. You cannot get a heavy flatbed through a 5FT flood zone. The medical triage is at Sector 6. If you do not fix the routing number right now, the generators will sit on a wet highway while the clinic goes completely dark by nightfall." Warren stared at the board. His eyes tracked the grid, verifying my claim in a matter of seconds. His jaw tightened slightly. The mistake was glaringly obvious once pointed out. He turned his attention slowly back to me. "You answered 2 of my questions," he noted. "You did not answer the 3rd. Why did you not just stay quiet?" I looked at the towering pallets of water and medicine, then back up to the imposing general. "Because when adults misplace things, the poor are always the first ones to suffer," I told him, "and nobody ever apologizes to them." A profound shift occurred in his expression. The rigid, demanding military mask cracked just a fraction of an inch for the first time since the rain washed my parents away. An adult looked at me and actually saw me. He saw the battered edges, the quiet rage, and the systemic understanding of someone who knew exactly what it meant to be collateral damage. Warren took the red marker from my hand. He corrected the board himself in broad, harsh strokes. He then called over a dispatch supervisor, delivered a brief but terrifying reprimand about double-checking manifests, and immediately rerouted the trucks. When he was finished, he turned back to me. He asked for my name. He asked who brought me there. He did not offer me a sympathetic smile, and he did not offer me a single ounce of pity. He simply told me that an eye for logistics was an exceptionally rare asset, and that he would speak to my guardians before the day ended. I expected him to vanish. They always vanished. People love the grand idea of helping a cynical orphan right up until the exact moment it requires actual consistent work. But Warren Holloway was not built like other people. 3 days later, a black car pulled into the cracked concrete driveway of my temporary foster home. He arrived exactly at the hour he had promised. He sat in the cramped, cheap living room and spoke to my foster parents. He came back the following week and the week after that. He navigated the endless red tape of the state system with the ruthless efficiency of a man conducting a prolonged military campaign. He did not come to save me because I was a tragic charity case. He came back because he recognized a fellow soldier who had been left behind enemy lines, fighting a silent war she never asked for. He kept his word. Time and time again, he proved that his presence in my life was not an act of fleeting mercy, but a deliberate, calculated decision to pull me from the wreckage. The estate of Bracken Point sat anchored against the shifting tides of the salt marshes just outside Savannah, Georgia. It was not a sprawling, ostentatious mansion built by new money, eager to impress the local socialites. It was a fortress of weathered cedar, ancient brick, and solid iron. The air there always tasted faintly of brine and pluff mud. Inside, the house operated less like a traditional home and more like a tactical command center. The heavy oak tables were perpetually covered in topographical maps, property ledgers, and meticulous maintenance logs. The low hum of industrial braid machinery from the eastern outbuildings provided a constant reassuring heartbeat to the property. Everything at Bracken Point had a designated place, a specific purpose, and a rigid schedule that was observed with the reverence of a holy ritual. The legal process of prying me loose from the state system was excruciatingly slow. It took 14 months of relentless paperwork, deep background checks, and exhausting bureaucratic friction. I kept my clothes tightly rolled in my suitcase the entire time. I simply did not possess the psychological capacity to believe the arrangement was permanent until the very morning a federal judge finally stamped the absolute last piece of paper. Walking out of the courthouse, I expected a grand speech. I expected a sentimental hug or a dramatic, tearful declaration of a new beginning. Warren Holloway merely stopped by the driver's side of his heavy utility truck, looked at me over the metal roof, and delivered a single dry sentence. From today onward, you do not need to prepare to be sent away anymore. Life at the Marsh estate was a jarring departure from every foster house I had ever known. On my very first afternoon, Warren dropped a heavy brass key ring directly into my palm. He did not hand me a laminated list of house rules. He handed me a schedule of operational responsibilities. I was expected to pull my weight immediately. Nobody ever demanded that I perform breathless, tearful gratitude for the hot food on my plate or the solid roof over my head. Charity was never once weaponized against me to make me feel small. However, absolute accountability was mandatory. If I left a wrench out in the rain, I cleaned the rust off it the next morning. If I failed to secure the heavy storm shutters properly, I stood out in the howling wind to fix them. I was not allowed to drift through life like a helpless victim waiting for a miraculous rescue. Warren did not teach me how to be soft, and he certainly did not teach me how to be conventionally lovable to society. He taught me how to stand entirely on my own 2 feet in a world specifically designed to knock people down and steal their shoes. While other girls my age were learning to ride horses or taking private tennis lessons at the local country club, I was sitting across from a retired general learning to dissect complex corporate financial reports. He taught me how to read the hidden liabilities on a balanced sheet and understand the ruthless mathematics of compound interest. He taught me how to listen closely to the cadence of a person's voice and detect the exact moment they were lying or hiding a selfish motive beneath polite, refined conversation. More importantly, he taught me practical, hard-nosed resilience. Before the heavy storm season hit the coast every single August, we spent days checking the industrial generators, rotating the emergency water rations, and mapping out secondary evacuation routes. He trained me to keep my heart rate perfectly steady when provoked by arrogant fools. He repeatedly told me that anger was a severe tactical disadvantage, and giving your enemy a visible emotional reaction was the exact same thing as handing them a loaded rifle and pointing it directly at your own chest. He was not a man who coddled. Praise from Warren Holloway was exceptionally rare, but when it came, it was forged in pure iron. A single brief nod of approval from him carried vastly more weight than 1,000 hollow, sugary compliments from strangers. He never talked down to me. He treated me with the blunt, unvarnished respect one soldier affords another who has bled on the exact same dirt. I grew up with the sharp scent of salt permanently woven into my hair and the deafening evening chorus of marsh seekers in my ears. Our dinners were quiet, deliberate affairs where we discussed civic duty, logistical supply chains, and personal accountability as if they were oxygen necessary for human survival. When it came time to choose a profession, I did not enlist in the armed forces. Warren never pressured me to wear a military uniform or salute a flag to prove my worth. I chose a path that aligned perfectly with the fundamental nature he had carefully cultivated in my bones. I studied systems management and crisis coordination at the State University. At 24 years old, I took a demanding position at the North Basin Emergency Logistics Office. The name sounded purely bureaucratic and deeply unglamorous, but the agency functioned as the absolute central nervous system for disaster relief across the entire coastal region. We coordinated the massive fleets of heavy trucks managed the fragile supply lines, and directed the earth-moving machinery when the hurricanes eventually ripped the coastline to shreds. My intense work at North Basin solidified something profound and vital between Warren and me. It proved to him that I was not merely a broken bird he had rescued from the pavement out of lingering guilt. I had become the true inheritor of his foundational philosophy. I operated entirely without noise or vanity. I did not seek out the flashing television cameras when disaster struck our communities. I simply appeared at the exact coordinates where the local infrastructure was violently collapsing, and I used a clipboard, a radio, and pure discipline to force the chaos back into strict order. This quiet, relentless competence was precisely what Warren had always prayed for in an heir. He recognized me as his true successor, in spirit, if not in biological fact. And it was precisely this realization that triggered the creeping, insidious panic among his blood relatives when I was just a quiet, traumatized teenager hauling heavy bags of fertilizer around the sprawling estate. They could easily dismiss me. They could comfortably view me as Warren's eccentric charity project, a temporary nuisance that would eventually age out, collect a small severance check, and disappear back into the working class. But as I grew into the formidable, unflappable woman the general had meticulously forged, the dynamic within the wealthy family shifted entirely. Evelyn, Grant, and Camille began to watch me with a new, deeply unsettled weariness. I was no longer a pitiable burden they could graciously tolerate at the annual Thanksgiving table to prove their own morality. I knew exactly how the estate ran from the ground up. I held the master keys to the heavy outbuildings. I understood the complex legal structures and tax liabilities of the coastal properties vastly better than any of them did. I did not shrink when Grant raised his voice in a pathetic attempt to intimidate me, and I did not flinch or blush when Camille launched her thinly veiled, aristocratic insults about my origins. They looked at me and realized with a sudden, suffocating terror that the ragged orphan they had spent a decade mocking had quietly become a permanent, load-bearing pillar in the Holloway empire. I was no longer a stray dog sleeping on the back porch. I was an immovable object standing directly between them and the absolute, uncontested control they so desperately craved. And they hated me for it with a cold passion that burnt far hotter than the suffocating Georgia sun. For over a decade, Evelyn Holloway treated the coastal estate of Bracken Point as though it were located on a hostile alien planet. She found the thick Georgia humidity entirely oppressive, the smell of the salt marsh offensive, and the persistent insect life a personal insult to her high society sensibilities. During my teenage years, I could count the number of times she visited on one single hand. Yet, as the regional coastal property values began to experience a massive unprecedented explosion driven by a sudden influx of luxury resort developers and high-end marina construction teams, her visits miraculously transformed from non-existent to aggressively frequent. She started arriving 2 or 3 times a month in perfectly tailored linen suits, her sharp eyes scanning the sprawling, untouched acreage. She did not look at the ancient moss-draped oak trees with familial fondness or nostalgic warmth. She looked at them with the cold, hungry calculation of a corporate auditor tallying up a column of highly profitable assets. Grant Holloway, Warren's nephew, was cut from the exact same mercenary cloth, though he preferred to dress his unvarnished Greek in the sterile modern vocabulary of high corporate finance. Grant was a man who possessed the terrifying ability to look at a breathtaking sunset over the tidal flats and see only commercial zoning permits. He never spoke of cutting down the forests or paving over the protected wetlands. Instead, he spoke passionately to anyone who would listen about maximizing developmental vision, optimizing dormant asset potential, and synergizing the estate's geographic footprint. He looked at a formidable legacy built over 75 years of sweat and military discipline and saw only a massive pile of collateral. To Grant, Bracken Point was simply a giant poker chip that could be heavily leveraged, creatively subdivided, or sold outright to the highest bidder for tens of millions of dollars. Camille, Grant's impeccably styled wife, was the perfect venomous accessory to his towering ambitions in public social settings. Camille possessed the polished, untouchable grace of an old-money Southern wife, effortlessly handing out bright, charming smiles and flawlessly polite conversation, to the local elite in private behind closed doors where only the family could hear. Her tongue was a serrated razor blade. I vividly remember a particularly suffocating Sunday afternoon out on the sunlit veranda. The temperature was pushing 95. She was elegantly sipping the glass of iced tea, watching me tally the heavy equipment inventory for the impending hurricane season. She leaned over to a visiting second cousin and whispered, deliberately projecting her voice just enough to ensure the words struck my ears. She referred to me as Uncle Warren's absolute most successful charity project. She framed the vicious insult as an elegant, sophisticated joke. It was a calculated, witty observation specifically designed to remind everyone present that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much blood I poured into the soil of that estate, I was merely an imported stray playing a pathetic game of dress-up in a rarefied world that belonged to her exclusively by right of marriage. Warren, of course, was an absolute immovable concrete wall against their endless ambitions. Grant routinely brought thick, glossy investment prospectuses to the formal dinner table, casually suggesting that liquidating a mere 30% of the Western marshland could establish a highly lucrative tax-sheltered family trust fund that would secure their wealth for the next 100 years. Warren shot down every single proposal with a flat, unequivocal refusal. He did not yell and he did not argue. He simply said no, with the finality of a heavy steel door slamming shut. This constant, unyielding rejection festered darkly in Grant's mind because his immense ego could not accept the simple fact that the old general valued the untouched land vastly more than a mountain of cash. Grant constructed a highly convenient paranoid fiction. He convinced himself entirely that I was the one poisoning Warren's mind against his own flesh and blood. In Grant's deeply twisted narrative, I was a highly manipulative, scheming outsider, constantly whispering venom into the general's ear in the dark. He truly believed I was actively, maliciously working around the clock to permanently separate the rightful biological heirs from their rightful fortune. My extensive professional training in crisis logistics and disaster coordination made me an exceptionally acute listener. When you manage chaotic supply lines for a living, you learn to filter out the noise and isolate the critical data. I learned to quietly track the recurring obsessive themes in their hushed private conversations whenever they mistakenly assumed Warren was out of earshot or asleep. They did not talk about his health, his comfort, or his remarkable legacy of service. Their dialogue was an endless, terrifyingly practical loop concerning the exact location of safe deposit keys, the legal transfer of medical power of attorney, corporate signing rights, the allocation of board seats on the family holdings, and the urgent pressing necessity of recerning Bracken Point the absolute minute Warren drew his very last breath. Every single interaction they had with him was a thinly disguised reconnaissance mission. Whenever Grant attempted to play the role of the loving, beautiful nephew in front of the general, he laid the phrase family legacy on incredibly thick, wielding the words like a heavy wooden club to establish his dominance. And whenever Grant or Evelyn addressed me directly, they meticulously ensured the word adopted or wart found its way into the opening sentence. It was a deliberate, relentless verbal boundary line constantly drawn in the sand, designed specifically to systematically shrink my standing and erase my authority within the household. Warren saw absolutely everything. He observed this entire pathetic, transparent theater with the detached, analytical amusement of a seasoned battlefield commander watching an arrogant enemy stumble blindly into a carefully laid minefield. He spoke very little during their suffocating weekend visits, preferring to let them eagerly fill the empty silence with their own nervous, revealing greed. One evening, long after Evelyn and Grant's luxury vehicles had finally disappeared down the long gravel driveway, Warren sat on the back porch listening to the seekers. He poured himself a small measure of bourbon, stared out at the dark water, and delivered a profound lesson I would never forget. He told me that greedy people rarely show their true monstrous faces, while the dining table is still fully stocked and the host is still firmly in the room. They only expose their absolute worst, most predatory instincts when they believe the room is empty, and they finally see the master keys lying unprotected on the table. Warren did not simply sit in his armchair and wait for them to launch their inevitable strike. He went on the offensive. He began making quiet, highly confidential, unannounced trips into downtown Savannah. He spent countless hours cloistered securely inside Malcolm Sir's heavily soundproofed law office. He was methodically overhauling his massive ledgers, auditing the corporate trust funds, and executing a massive labyrinthine restructuring of his financial architecture that I did not fully comprehend at the time. He was silently building an invisible fortress out of paper and ink. He was planting legal tripwires and buried financial landmines, fully and accurately anticipating the brutal, ruthless war that would immediately erupt the second his heart stopped beating. The emotional culmination of this quiet, intense preparation happened just hours before one of the most suffocatingly fake Thanksgiving dinners we ever hosted at the estate. The air inside the large house was thick with forced hollow laughter and the overwhelming metallic stench of impending betrayal. Warren called me away from the kitchen and into the absolute privacy of his locked study. He reached deep into the bottom drawer of his heavy oak desk and handed me his old, tarnished brass military compass. The cold metal was worn completely smooth from decades of hard field use in foreign territories. He placed it squarely in my palm and closed my fingers tightly over it. He looked at me with an intense burning clarity that cut right through the polite, aristocratic facade we were about to endure in the dining room. He instructed me not to focus my attention on the person who loudly demands the physical house. He told me with absolute iron certainty to watch the person who desperately wants the absolute power to dictate the path forward. I slipped the heavy brass compass into my pocket, my mind racing to process the strategic weight of his words. I did not have the chance to fully decipher the warning. The luxury of time was suddenly and violently revoked. Before the winter season could even officially break, the vague, unspoken suspicions regarding Warren's declining health shifted overnight from a lingering shadow into a terrifying, undeniable, and fatal reality. The diagnosis arrived on a suffocating Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a grim oncologist who did not know how to look a decorated soldier directly in the eye. It was an aggressive, fast-moving lymphoma. The medical timeline was brutally short. While Warren's mind remained as razor-sharp and calculating as it had been on the battlefield, his physical body began a rapid, undeniable descent. The sprawling, sturdy walls of Bracken Point suddenly felt entirely different. The estate no longer felt like a fortress standing against the coastal storms. It felt like a massive ticking clock, echoing with the heavy, inescapable atmosphere of a silent countdown. I refused to take a leave of absence from the emergency logistics agency, knowing Warren would absolutely despise the idea of me abandoning my post. Instead, I simply stopped sleeping. I meticulously arranged my demanding dispatched shifts around his oncology appointments, his pain management schedules, and his rapidly changing dietary needs. My days became a blurring, exhausting marathon of charting medication doses, reviewing complex medical files, and acting as the primary gatekeeper for a sudden, overwhelming flood of visitors. It was a bitter, deeply illuminating experience to manage that front door. You learn exactly who people are when they smell the approaching end. There were genuine friends, old military comrades who sat by his bed in heavy silence, sharing a quiet, profound grief. And then there was the blood family. The absolute cruelest irony of Warren's physical decline was the miraculous effect it had on the attendance record of his relatives. Just as his energy faded, Evelyn, Grant, and Camille suddenly found the time to become the most dedicated, attentive family members on the eastern seaboard. They arrived constantly. They brought expensive bottles of imported wine he could no longer drink, and elaborate bakery boxes filled with rich pastries his failing stomach could no longer digest. They masked their morbid surveillance missions behind a thin, glossy veneer of exaggerated concern. Their inquiries were never genuinely about his pain levels or his comfort. They asked highly specific, probing questions, carefully disguised as casual conversation. Grant would lean against the heavy oak door frame, swirling a glass of bourbon, and ask if Uncle Warren had remembered to update the signature cards at the regional bank. Camille would sit close to his armchair, gently patting his frail hand while softly inquiring if the master codes to the estate security system needed to be transferred to someone more capable of managing the massive property. Evelyn hovered in the background, subtly taking visual inventory of the antique furniture and quietly suggesting that perhaps the legal burden of the estate was far too much for a dying man to carry alone. To my absolute shock, Warren did not fight them. The man who had spent his entire life crushing insubordination simply leaned back into his pillows, closed his eyes, and offered vague, tired nods. He allowed them to fully believe that the brutal weight of old age and terminal illness had finally softened his iron will. He let them think he was surrendering his command. It was a flawless, terrifying performance. Behind their backs, while they were busy measuring the drapes and silently dividing his assets, Warren was executing a surgical covert legal strike. He quietly instructed Malcolm Sir to finalize the ultimate cordial. These were not standard updates. Malcolm brought in independent psychiatric specialists to conduct rigorous documented competency examinations to definitively prove Warren was of perfectly sound mind. They gathered sworn statements from neutral witnesses. They bound the final directives under multiple layers of heavy legal seals, creating an airtight, impenetrable vault of paper that no desperate lawsuit could ever hope to break. Then Warren handed me the strangest, most unsettling directive of my life. He ordered me to conduct a microscopic, itemized inventory of every single tangible asset on the property. He did not just want a broad list of the major holdings. He demanded a comprehensive, exhaustive catalogue. I spent grueling nights documenting the provenance of the oil paintings in the main hall. I photographed every piece of antique family silver, every vintage mechanical watch in his collection, and every single leather-bound notebook stacked in his private study. He made me catalogue his retired military gear, the framed topographical maps, and the exact contents of the eastern outbuildings. Most unnervingly, he insisted I record the precise serial numbers and installation dates of the exterior gate cameras and the digital smart locks securing the main house. The sheer paranoia of the task filled me with a deep, chilling unease. I was cataloguing the estate as if preparing for a hostile, armed invasion. When I questioned him about the necessity of logging the security cameras, he simply stared out the window and refused to elaborate. The true scope of his vision finally revealed itself late one evening during one of the rare quiet hours when the house was entirely empty of vultures. We were sitting on the screened porch. The air was heavy with the smell of pluff mud, and the rising tide was slowly swallowing the tall marsh grass. Warren was breathing with shallow, difficult rasps, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. Without turning his head, he asked me a question that felt heavier than the humid night air. He asked me what exactly I would build if I were suddenly handed unlimited resources and absolute authority. I did not have to think about the answer. The dream had been quietly burning in the back of my mind for years, forged by every disaster I had witnessed and every broken family I had tried to root through the chaotic shelter systems. I told him I would build a transitional housing facility, not a cold, sterile government camp, but a fully sustained, dignified sanctuary for displaced veterans and families whose entire lives had been suddenly violently erased by coastal hurricanes. I wanted to create a place where people who had lost absolutely everything did not have to start their lives over while standing in a humiliating breadline. I wanted to build a fortress of recovery, utilizing the precise logistical discipline he had taught me to run it flawlessly. Warren did not offer a single word of praise. He did not smile, and he did not reach out to hold my hand. He simply closed his eyes and nodded his head very slowly for a very long time. In the dim light of the porch, the deep lines on his face seemed to momentarily relax. His eyes carried the profound, quiet satisfaction of a master chess player who had just locked his opponent into an inescapable final trap. He had found the exact answer he was looking for. His breathing grew shallower over the next 72 hours. The vibrant, commanding energy that had defined his entire existence was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind only the fragile shell of a legendary soldier. On his final night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. The medical equipment beat in a slow, rhythmic cadence. I sat beside his bed, holding his cold, thin hand, watching the man who had pulled me from the wreckage of my childhood slowly slip away. He turned his head toward me, fighting through the heavy haze of morphine to make absolutely sure his mind was clear. He gripped my fingers with a sudden, surprising strength, His voice was nothing more than a raspy, broken whisper, but the command embedded within it was absolute. He gave me my final orders. He explicitly warned me that the moment his heart stopped, the dogs would immediately break off their leashes. He ordered me not to fight over the antique furniture or the family silver. He commanded me not to engage in screaming matches or lower myself to their chaotic, desperate level. Most importantly, he told me never to touch the obvious bait that the others were so hungrily staring at, his eyes locked onto mine, burning with a fierce, fading light. The final sentence I ever heard him speak was not a declaration of love, but a profound tactical truth that would define everything that happened next. The one who truly deserves the legacy is rarely the person demanding it the loudest. 2 hours later, just as the morning sun began to bleed over the eastern edge of the salt marsh, General Warren Holloway drew his final breath. The heavy silence that followed was absolute, but it was not peaceful. He left behind a massive, towering void, a vacuum of power and wealth vast enough to invite both my crushing, paralyzing grief and their raid, animalistic greed to step through the front door at the exact same time. The funeral was a symphony of absolute rigid discipline. The heavy brass of the military band cut cleanly through the suffocating Georgia humidity, playing a slow, mournful cadence that demanded total silence from the civilian mourners. I stood at the edge of the manicured cemetery grass, watching the honor guard fold the heavy cotton flag with terrifying precision. Row upon row of aging veterans stood at attention, their spines straight despite the crushing weight of their years. When the ceremony concluded, they lined up to shake my hand. Their grips were rough, calloused, and deeply authentic. These were men who possessed an intimate, unspoken understanding of what it meant to permanently lose a battlefield commander. They looked at me with genuine sorrow, recognizing the massive void Warren had left behind. I did not even have the luxury of returning to the house to properly weep. The earth was barely settled over his casket before the hostile occupation officially commenced. Exactly 3 hours after the final prayer, I pulled my vehicle onto the long-crushed oyster shell driveway of Bracken Point. I expected to find an empty echoing house where I could finally allow the exhaustion to break me. Instead, I found a commercial locksmith van parked aggressively close to the front porch steps. Grant Holloway stood near the massive mahogany front door, entirely out of his black suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was animatedly directing a technician in a gray uniform who was actively drilling the core out of Warren's antique brass deadbolt. The screeching sound of the metal drill bit tearing through the lock felt like a physical blade sliding directly into my ribs. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my dark shoes. Grant turned around, entirely unbothered by the fact that he was actively dismantling the security of a dead man's home on the exact afternoon of his burial. Just ensuring the physical security of the primary assets, Grant announced loudly, not waiting for me to ask a single question. His voice carried the slick, practiced authority of a corporate liquidator. We cannot afford to leave a property of this immense, historical value vulnerable during the legal transition period. The insurance liabilities are simply too massive. He was lying, and he knew I knew he was lying. I bypassed him and walked into the grand foyer, only to find Evelyn Holloway waiting near the base of the sweeping staircase. She was still wearing her black mourning veil, pushed elegantly back over her silver hair. She folded her hands neatly over her purse and offered me a smile so intensely sweet it could rot wood. "Harper, dear," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with the condescending, insulated warmth of civil litigation. "This is a terribly confusing and chaotic time for everyone, but you must understand that, as the direct, biological next of kin, we have a legal obligation to establish firm boundaries regarding the estate. You really should respect the family boundaries and find temporary accommodations until Mr. Sir formally reads the will. It is simply the proper way things are done." I ignored her hollow performance and moved toward the hallway leading to Warren's private study, fully intending to grab my remaining work files and a few personal artifacts. The heavy oak door was already sealed shut. A brand new digital keypad glowed coldly next to the brass handle. I quickly realized it was not just the study. The exterior, gate codes, the heavy deadbolt on the kitchen entrance, The padlocks on the eastern storage sheds, every single point of access had been systematically compromised and replaced while I was standing at the grave site. They had locked me out of my own life before I could even wipe the dirt from my shoes. I turned back toward the front door, my chest tightening with a cold, compressed fury. Camille was standing on the top step of the porch, looking down at me as I approached the threshold. She glanced deliberately at the small scuffed leather suitcase I had managed to pull from my car trunk. "I truly hope you possess the maturity to understand the distinct difference between fond memories and actual tangible wealth," Camille said, her voice dropping to a vicious quiet register meant exclusively for my ears. "Uncle Warren gave you a remarkable childhood. That was a beautiful act of charity, but you need to learn the difference between received kindness and rightful ownership. This house belongs to the Holloway bloodline. You are simply a guest whose invitation has officially expired before I could formulate a response that would not completely violate Warren's final orders to remain calm. A shadow shifted near the massive azalea bushes bordering the driveway. It was Thomas, the elderly groundskeeper who had maintained the sprawling marsh property for over 3 decades. He caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod toward the side path. I walked down the steps, bypassing Camille's triumphant smirk, and met Thomas behind the thick wall of blooming flowers. The old man smelled of damp earth and tobacco. Without speaking a single word, he reached into the deep pocket of his canvas work jacket and pressed a heavy taped manila envelope directly into my hands. I retreated to the absolute privacy of my vehicle before tearing the thick paper open. Inside, I found 3 specific items. The first was a heavy rusted iron key that did not belong to any door at Bracken Point. It was the master key to a secure off-site commercial archive unit located near the downtown shipping docks. The second item was a florless carbon copy of the meticulous, exhaustive inventory ledger Warren had forced me to compile during his final 30 days. The third item was a small torn piece of yellow legal paper. It contained exactly 4 words, written in Warren's unmistakable sharp handwriting. "Do not react early." I stared at the paper as the chaotic noise of the estate faded into a dull roar. The instruction was clear. Hold the line. Let them overextend. As the sun began to aggressively sink below the treeline, Grant escalated his hostile takeover. He did not even grant me the dignity of packing my own clothes. He hired 2-day laborers to haul 3 large, hastily taped cardboard boxes out the front door and dumped them unceremoniously onto the gravel driveway. The boxes contained my winter coats, a few pairs of boots, and the scattered remnants of a life I had built over 14 years. I watched them handle my belongings with the detached indifference of men clearing out a terminated live-in maid. I loaded the boxes into my trunk in absolute silence, refusing to give Grant or Camille the satisfaction of a single tear or a raised voice. The cruelty did not stop at the property line. Camille possessed the toxic energy of a woman who needed an audience to validate her cruelty. She did not even wait for the weekend to pass. By Tuesday evening, she had already planted the seeds of a vicious rumor among her wealthy acquaintances at the regional country club. She sat in the dining room sipping expensive cocktails and softly lamented to anyone who would listen about the tragic situation with the adopted girl. She spun a brilliant fictional narrative portraying me as a hysterical, emotionally unstable outsider desperately trying to hold the family legacy hostage using guilt and manipulation. I drove away from the marsh and moved into a tiny cramped room located directly above the detached garage of my close colleague Nora Pike. Nora worked dispatch at the emergency logistics agency with me, and she asked absolutely 0 questions when I showed up at 9:00 at night with my entire life packed into a trunk, sitting on the edge of a cheap, unfamiliar mattress surrounded by the smell of motor oil and old wood. The reality of the situation crashed over me. I was not burning with a hot, explosive rage. I was filled with a deep, terrifyingly cold pain. It was the horrific realization that there are human beings walking this earth who eagerly anticipate the agonizing death of a relative the exact same way a desperate shopper waits for a massive grand opening sale. To them, Warren's last breath was simply the ringing of a cash register. But as I sat in the dim light of that cramped garage room, gently running my thumb over the rough edge of the iron key Thomas had slipped me, a profound clarity pierced through my grief. I was suddenly looking at the chessboard from a completely different elevated angle. They had aggressively kicked me out of the estate. They had changed the locks, seized the physical ground, and declared a premature absolute victory. But they fundamentally misunderstood the man they had just buried. General Warren Holloway never engaged in a single battle without meticulously mapping out the exact routes for a tactical retreat and a devastating counterattack. The ambush at the estate was not my defeat. It was simply the opening phase of his final campaign, and they had just blindly triggered the very first tripwire. The air inside the Commercial Archive facility on the industrial side of the river tasted heavily of stale cardboard and harsh chemical floor cleaner. The building was a massive windowless concrete bunker designed exclusively for the quiet storage of forgotten corporate records and excess inventory. I walked down the echoing, poorly lit corridor until I found the rolling steel door of Unit 412. I slid the heavy rusted iron key Thomas had slipped me into the deadbolt. The lock turned with a satisfying heavy clack. When I rolled the corrugated metal door upward, the harsh fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing an entirely unexpected sight. I had mentally prepared myself to find boxes of antique family silver, hidden cash reserves, or perhaps old sentimental military journals Warren had wanted to keep hidden from his greedy relatives. Instead, the unit was meticulously packed with towering stacks of heavy banker boxes, oversized architectural blueprint tubes, and tightly bound legal ledgers. I spent 6 hours sitting on the cold concrete floor, reading through the dense paperwork. It was like deciphering the master schematic of a ghost empire. Warren had not merely been sitting in his armchair, stubbornly hoarding the family land, as Grant and Evelyn believed. He had been actively, aggressively building. I found massive stacks of limited liability company filings, all registered under bland, untraceable names. Attached to these corporate documents were the architectural blueprints for the complete renovation of 4 abandoned interstate highway motels. He had purchased massive climate-controlled warehousing space near the deep-water shipping ports. Most astonishingly, I found his private handwritten journals entirely dedicated to the logistical framework of post-storm transitional housing. He had taken the exact conversation we share on the back porch, my desperate vision of creating a dignified sanctuary for displaced families and veterans, and he had quietly funded and engineered the entire structural foundation for it. He owned the staging grounds. He owned the supply routes. He had built a regional emergency logistics network that perfectly mirrored the public agency I worked for, except his was entirely private, massively funded, and waiting for a commander. But the most breathtaking discovery, the one that made my blood run absolutely cold with awe, was buried inside a thick red-tacked folder labeled with the address of the main estate. I read through the property deeds, the municipal tax assessments, and the regional zoning covenants governing Bracken Point. Grant and Evelyn were currently tearing each other apart, absolutely convinced that the coastal property was a limitless gold mine waiting to be liquidated. The documents in my hands told a vastly different, terrifyingly expensive story. Warren had legally bound the entire estate under the strictest historical preservation clauses available in the state of Georgia. Furthermore, the mandatory coastal erosion engineering reports sitting in the file clearly outlined the absolute necessity of a total reconstruction of the property's structural seawall within the next 24 months. The estimated cost for that single reinforcement project was several million combined with the astronomical annual property taxes and the specialized marshland maintenance fees. Bracken Point was not a liquid asset. It was a beautiful, sprawling financial black hole. It only possessed massive commercial value if a developer deliberately broke the historical agreements, paved over the protected wetlands, and paid the catastrophic federal fines, a specific violation that Warren had legally ensured would trigger immediate total forfeit of the land. He had handed them a fortress made entirely of debt. Later, that same evening, I met Darius Cole at a brightly lit, grease-stained diner located near the commercial shipping yards. Darius was a retired supply sergeant who had served under Warren for 12 years, a man whose loyalty to the general was carved into his bones. He sat across from me, his massive hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the rain streak against the diner window. I asked him if he knew what Warren was planning during those final secretive months. Darius let out a low, rough chuckle that sounded like grinding stones. The general knew exactly what his nephew was. Darius rumbled, his dark eyes locking onto mine. I sat with him one afternoon when the pain was bad, and I asked him why he didn't just call his lawyer and lock those vultures out of the will completely. It would have been easy. He looked at me completely serious and told me that fighting them up front gives them a target to shoot at. He said, letting greed sign its own name on the evidence is always the absolute best way to save ammunition. I understood the assignment perfectly. I spent the next 2 days meticulously gathering the ammunition. I secured the digital receipt from the commercial locksmith Grant had hired to drill out the front door, complete with the exact timestamp of the service call. I printed the high-resolution photographs I had taken of my personal belongings sitting abandoned in cheap cardboard boxes on the gravel driveway. The most critical piece of evidence, however, came from an elderly neighbor who lived further down the coastal bend. They possessed a high-end dockside security camera system that pointed toward the shared access road. They casually forwarded me the digital footage. The video clearly and undeniably showed Grant's hired moving truck idling by the estate side entrance on the exact afternoon of the funeral. I placed all of these documents into a thick manila envelope and delivered it directly to Malcolm Sir's downtown office. Malcolm sat behind his massive oak desk, carefully reviewing the locksmith invoices and the surveillance stills. He possessed the completely blank, unreadable expression of a man who played high-stakes poker for a living. He did not offer any dramatic gasps of shock or soft words of comfort regarding my eviction. He simply tapped his expensive silver fountain pen against the leather desk mat, looked up, and asked me one single highly specific question. Harper, were you physically and intentionally barred from entering the primary residence before the final testament was formally published to the beneficiaries? Yes, I answered evenly. Malcolm nodded once slowly. He slipped the evidence into a lockbox beneath his desk. I realized instantly that his question was not a casual inquiry driven by empathy. It was a rigid, necessary legal parameter being perfectly met. The trap was setting. While I was quietly sitting in the lawyer's office, Grant was already making his arrogant, fatal moves. Believing he operated entirely in a secure vacuum where no one possessed the authority to challenge him, he had quietly arranged for an independent middleman to transport several of Warren's most valuable 18th-century naval clocks from the estate. He was shipping them across state lines to a high-end auction house in Atlanta, desperate for quick, untraceable liquidity before the probate courts could even officially open their doors. He thought he was moving like a ghost, entirely unaware that the serial numbers of those exact clocks were already registered in the final inventory ledger, resting securely in my bag. The following morning, the family launched another aggressive strike. Camille ambushed me. I was walking out of a small coffee shop near the logistics agency holding a paper cup when her sleek luxury SUV pulled aggressively up to the curb blocking the crosswalk. She stepped out onto the pavement wearing oversized designer sunglasses and an impeccably tailored silk blouse. She did not bother with pleasantries. She walked straight up to me and handed me a crisp cream-colored envelope. Inside the envelope was a certified cashier's check made out for $25,000 and a heavily worded legal waiver. The document required my signature, officially relinquishing all emotional, physical, and financial expectations regarding the estate. "Take the money, Harper," Camille said, leaning against the polished door of her vehicle. "Grant is even willing to let you keep Uncle Warren's rusted 10-year-old pickup truck to help you move to a different city. Think of it as a very generous severance package for a long, exhausting internship. Sign the paper, cash the check, and walk away with your dignity intact before the lawyers officially leave you with absolutely nothing." I looked at the check, then up at Camille. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the paper in her face, and I did not tell her to go to hell. I simply folded the document along its original crease, slid it carefully back into the cream envelope, and handed it directly back to her. "You really should hold on to this, Camille," I said. I kept my voice impeccably polite. warm, and entirely steady. I have a very strong feeling that you and your husband are going to need every single dollar of liquid cash you can find in the extremely near future. Have a wonderful afternoon." The absolute lack of anger or fear in my voice rattled her deeply. Her smug, aristocratic smile faltered, replaced by a sudden sharp flicker of genuine uncertainty. People like Camille know exactly how to handle tears and rage. They are completely terrified by quiet, polite confidence. It was late Friday evening when my cell phone finally rang, breaking the silence of my cramped garage apartment. It was Malcolm, sir. His voice was tired, growly, and entirely stripped of all professional pleasantries. The date and time for the formal reading of the will were officially set. He did not offer me a pep talk. He did not ask how I was holding up. He simply delivered a final directive that made the air in my lungs stop completely. On the day of the reading, Malcolm instructed, his tone heavy with absolute authority. "You do not speak. You do not react to their inheritances. You just need to sit perfectly still until I finish reading the very last page." The 48 hours leading up to the formal reading of the will were a master class in psychological warfare. Grant Holloway was so absolutely certain of his impending coronation that he had already begun issuing executive commands. Through my remaining contacts at the logistics agency, I learned that Grant had boldly scheduled an emergency board meeting for Breakwater Response Holdings, the massive, supposedly dormant family corporation he believed he was about to inherit for 900 the very next morning. He was not even waiting for the ink to dry on the probate documents before attempting to seize the throne. Simultaneously, a highly coordinated, vicious smear campaign began to quietly saturate the wealthy social circles of Savannah. It was not a direct, actionable leal that I could drag into a courtroom. It was far more insidious. A blind item appeared in a prominent local society newsletter, heavily implying that an overly ambitious adopted daughter of a recently deceased local military hero was aggressively attempting to usurp the rightful biological heirs through emotional manipulation. It was a perfectly crafted piece of toxic gossip designed specifically to humiliate me and preemptively destroy my professional credibility in the coastal community. They were aggressively salting the earth before they even claimed the deed to the farm. When we finally reconvened in the suffocatingly chilled conference room of Malcolm Sir's downtown law firm, the atmosphere was thick with their premature victory. The scene was exactly as I had left it moments ago. Evelyn sat with the quiet, elevated nobility of a reigning queen waiting for her formal tribute. Grant visibly vibrated with an arrogant, restless energy, his eyes repeatedly darting toward the thick leather document tube on the table, practically salivating for the master keys to the empire. Camille leaned back in her plush chair. Catching my eye, she offered me a slow, knowing smile, possessing the exact smug expression of a theatergoer who had already read the script and was simply waiting for the tragic heroine to die in the final act. Malcolm Sir did not rush. He possessed the deliberate, agonizingly slow cadence of a man who understood the profound gravity of transferring a lifetime of wealth. He broke the heavy wax seal on the primary testament, adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, and began to read. The legal language was dense, archaic, and brutally clear. Every single syllable felt like a heavy steel hammer systematically driving nails into the coffin of my hopes. Malcolm read the property disbursements first. The sprawling of the historic coastal estate of Bracken Point, including all adjacent marshlands, deep-water docks, and the primary residential structures, was bequeathed jointly and exclusively to Evelyn and Grant Holloway. Grant let out a sharp, quiet exhale, a sound of pure, unadulterated greed. Being fully satisfied, he immediately pulled his expensive smartphone from his tailored vest pocket and began rapidly typing a message under the mahogany table. He was undoubtedly texting his corporate attorneys or his eager real estate developers, giving them the green light to begin the aggressive subdivision of the general's beloved land. Malcolm continued the slow, methodical slaughter. The vast collections of 18th-century family antiques, the original oil paintings, the heavily funded memorial trusts, and the official position of the Holloway family representative on all civic boards were handed over to Evelyn. The tangible wealth, the prestige, The entire visible legacy of General Warren Holloway was formally and legally stripped away from me and draped over the shoulders of the exact people who had spent his final months actively waiting for his heart monitor to flatline. My name was finally spoken on page 14. The contrast was humiliatingly stark to his ward, Harper Baker. Warren bequeathed a shockingly short, almost insulting list of items. I was officially granted the tarnished brass military compass I already held in my possession. I was given the complete physical contents of the dilapidated Eastern storage shed, a building the family believed held nothing but rusted gardening tools and old tractor parts. I was permitted to retrieve my own personal clothing and immediate daily effects, provided I did so under the strict supervision of the new property owners. Finally, I was left one single sealed envelope containing a personal letter. That was the entire sum of my inheritance. 14 years of relentless loyalty, sheer discipline, and quiet devotion. Legally reduced to a rusted compass and an old shed, Camille could not contain her malicious joy a second longer. She leaned across the polished table, invading my personal space, her expensive perfume masking the stench of her cruelty. "It is exactly as I told you," Camille whispered, her voice a sharp, slicing hiss meant only for me. "Some people can be raised with all the manners and money in the world, Harper, but at the end of the day, you will always just be a temporary guest. It is time for you to pack up those cheap boxes and move along." I sat perfectly still. I remembered Malcolm's strict final directive from the telephone call. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, digging my fingernails into my palms to anchor myself to the present moment. Despite knowing that Warren was a master tactician, despite holding the secret archive key in my pocket, hearing the cold legal division of his life out loud was profoundly devastating. I looked down at the table, my shoulders naturally dropping. I did not have to fake the crushing weight of the grief. To the three vultures sitting across from me, I looked exactly like a broken, defeated orphan who had just lost her father for the second permanent time. Malcolm reached the bottom of the 16th page. He formally concluded the reading of the primary will and testament. Evelyn let out a long theatrical sigh of profound relief, lifting her chin to survey her newly confirmed kingdom. Grant tossed his smartphone onto the table with a loud, arrogant clatter, fully prepared to stand up, shake the lawyer's hand, and demand the immediate transfer of the property deeds. The war was over. They had won absolute, total control of the whole legacy before I could even fire a single shot. But Malcolm Sir did not close the heavy manila folder. He did not offer them his congratulations. He did not ask his assistant to bring in the final signature pages. Instead, he slowly moved the primary testament to the left side of his desk. He reached his wrinkled hands forward and pulled the heavy black leather document tube into the center of the leather mat. The room suddenly fell deathly quiet. Grant froze halfway out of his chair. Evelyn's triumphant smile hardened into a mask of sudden, rigid confusion. Malcolm looked directly at Grant, then at Evelyn, and finally rested his heavy, tired gaze on me. He placed his hand flat on top of a separate, thickly bound stack of papers that had been hidden entirely beneath the leather tube. "We are not finished," Malcolm stated, his deep baritone voice shattering their fragile victory into 1,000 pieces. "What I have just read constitutes the primary framework of the estate. However, there are highly specific conditional addendums. There are extensive attached schedules of legal obligations. And there is one final page left bearing the General's explicit non-negotiable instructions that it absolutely must be read publicly to all parties present in this room." The heavy silence in the conference room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Grant slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. Evelyn sat perfectly rigid, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her vintage purse. They had just been handed the keys to the kingdom, but Malcolm Sir was holding a ring of iron chains right behind them. Malcolm pulled the thick stack of gray legal paper forward. "The primary testament grants ownership of Bracken Point," Malcolm began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But that ownership is legally contingent upon the immediate acceptance of several non-negotiable, heavily audited financial obligations. The estate is bound by a strict historical preservation trust. To accept the deed, the beneficiaries must legally commit to fully funding the mandatory coastal sea wall reconstruction. Malcolm adjusted his glasses and read the exact figure. Estimated engineering and construction costs are projected at $2,400,000. This project must be fully completed within 24 months of the transfer of the deed. Grant's jaw slackened. The vibrant color rapidly drained from his face. He had viewed the Marsh estate as a massive golden ticket, a property he could immediately bulldoze and sell to luxury resort developers. Malcolm did not pause to let them breathe. He continued reading the restrictive covenants. Furthermore, the beneficiaries are legally prohibited from subdividing the acreage, altering the original architectural footprint, or transferring the deed to any commercial entity for a minimum period of 25 years. You are also required to assume the severance packages for all long-term staff, guaranteeing 100% of their current salary for a period of 10 years. And you must immediately deposit $500,000 in liquid cash into a mandatory storm recovery escrow account. The golden asset had instantly transformed into an incredibly expensive, immovable fortress of debt. Grant let out a sharp, ragged breath. He was a man who lived on leveraged credit and high-risk loans. He did not possess $2 million in liquid cash to pour into a seawall, and he certainly could not wait a quarter of a century to see a return on his investment. But the financial devastation was only the beginning of the ambush. Malcolm turned the page, moving from the restrictive covenants to the supplementary declarations. He opened the exact manila envelope I had handed him days prior. Moving forward, Malcolm stated, his tone growing noticeably sharper, I must formally log into the legal record a series of unauthorized premature asset interactions. I have sworn affidavit, photographic documentation, and digital surveillance verifying that significant portions of the estate were altered or removed before the probate courts officially opened. Camille stiffened in her chair. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug fiercely into the polished mahogany table. Malcolm began listing the indisputable facts with lethal precision. 3 18th-century naval clocks bearing serial numbers matching the master inventory ledger were removed from the property and are currently in transit to an auction house in Atlanta. A commercial locksmith was hired to drill and replace the primary security deadbolts on the main house at precisely 4:00 in the afternoon on the day of the burial. Additionally, personal property belonging to Harper Baker was forcefully removed from the premises and abandoned on the driveway on that exact same evening. The temperature in the room plummeted. The absolute terrifying reality of their situation began to crystallize. Camille lost her sophisticated composure entirely. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stared at the lawyer with wide, panicked eyes. Evelyn was the first to find her voice, though her southern drawl had lost all its sweet, aristocratic insulation. "Excuse me, Malcolm," Evelyn interrupted, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound indignity and sudden fear. "What on earth does a locksmith, invoice, or the location of a few old clocks have to do with the legal division of my brother's estate? We were simply securing the property. You are reading a list of petty, irrelevant grievances." Malcolm looked up from the documents. His eyes were cold, reflecting the ruthless legal machinery he was currently operating. "It has absolutely everything to do with your inheritance, Evelyn," Malcolm answered flatly. General Holloway fully anticipated these exact actions. He spent his final months drafting a highly specific, legally binding courtal that explicitly addresses any hostile behavior post-funeral. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Hostile behavior, post-funeral. Grant completely lost his mind. He slammed both of his hands onto the table, half rising from his chair. "Show me that paper right now," Grant demanded, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "You are bluffing. My uncle would never authorize this kind of surveillance. Give me that document right now, Malcolm." Malcolm did not flinch. He did not hand over the paper. He simply placed his heavy hand flat over the remaining folder and stared Grant down with the authority of a federal judge. "Sit down, Grant," Malcolm commanded. The sheer force in his voice forced the younger man back into his seat. The general's final instructions were explicitly clear and legally unshakable. The file page containing the consequences of the courtesan can only be opened and read after every single beneficiary in this room verbally confirms they have heard and fully comprehend the evidence of their own actions. Do you understand the evidence I just read into the record? I sat perfectly still, my hands resting quietly on my knees, watching the magnificent, brutal trap snapped shut. Every single piece of paper lying on that mahogany table was not just a dry legal file. It was a floorless, unbreakable chain of evidence Warren had meticulously fed them. He knew their greed was a rabid, starving animal. He did not just build a trap. He deliberately laid out the bait, handed them the rope, and patiently waited for them to tie the noose around their own necks. The united front of the Holloway family shattered instantly. Panic is a highly corrosive acid, and it immediately dissolved their wealthy, polite facade. Evelyn turned entirely in her seat, glaring at Grant with absolute vicious hatred. "You arrogant fool," Evelyn hissed, completely abandoning her refined persona. "I explicitly told you to wait. I told you not to touch the locks until the lawyers gave the official clearance. You just could not contain your pathetic greed for one single week." Grant's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He immediately spun around and pointed an accusing finger at his wife. "Do not put this entirely on me," Grant snarled back. "Camille is the one who insisted we throw her out immediately. Camille is the one who wanted the house completely empty so she could start bringing in the interior designers. I merely suggested we secure our assets," Camille shot back, her voice shrill and desperate. "You are the one who illegally fenced the antique clocks to pay off your own private equity debts." The conference room devolved into a bitter, venomous snake pit. They were tearing each other to pieces, desperately trying to assign the blame for a catastrophic failure they had all eagerly participated in. The atmosphere had completely violently shifted from a glorious, triumphant coronation to a suffocating, terrifying hostage situation. They had walked into the law office firmly believing they were the absolute masters of the universe, and now they were painfully realizing they were nothing more than rats caught in a steel cage. Malcolm let them fight for a full 2 minutes. He let the terror thoroughly saturate their blood. Then he picked up his silver pen and tapped it sharply against the desk, cutting through their chaotic shouting. Silence fell over the room once again, but it was no longer the heavy silence of my forced submission. It was the terrified, breathless silence of 3 people waiting for the executioner to speak. Malcolm slowly moved his hand away from the restrictive covenants. He reached forward and picked up the dark wax-sealed envelope that had been resting beneath the leather tube the entire time. He looked straight into Evelyn's eyes, then Grant's, then Camille's. And finally he looked at me. "The conditions of comprehension have been met," Malcolm stated, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute finality of a loaded gun. "Now I will break this seal. I will read the exact terms General Holloway demanded be read last, and only last." They had won almost the entire will reading. They had tasted the absolute peak of their arrogant victory. And as Malcolm Sir broke the dark green wax seal, they realized with a crushing, suffocating horror that the real battle had not even begun. Malcolm smoothed the heavy parchment flat against his desk. The conference room was so violently still I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of his expensive wristwatch. He did not look at any of the Holloway family members. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the final document left behind by General Warren Holloway. "This is a legally binding conditional revocation," Malcolm read, his voice cutting through the chilled, sterile air like a serrated blade. "Should any named beneficiary in the primary testament engage in hostile actions against my ward, Harper Baker, prior to the formal opening of probate, their entire tangible inheritance shall be immediately and permanently revoked." He paused for a fraction of a second, allowing the sheer terrifying weight of the word revoked to fully settle over the mahogany table. Then he read the specific fatal triggers. Hostile actions are explicitly defined as follows. First, the unauthorized alteration of any physical security blocks at the primary estate. Second, the denial of Harper Baker's established right of residency. Third, the removal or relocation of any physical assets, antiques, or heirlooms before the legal inventory is concluded. Fourth, any attempt to coerce Harper Baker into signing a financial or emotional waiver. And fifth, any unauthorized communication with commercial developers regarding the potential sale or rezoning of Bracken Point. The entire room froze into solid ice. Every single condition had just been met in the span of 6 days. Every single trap had been aggressively triggered by their own blinding, impatient greed. But Waring had not merely left a list of rules. He had engineered a flawlessly executed military ambush. Malcolm reached into the secondary folder and began pulling out the physical proof. "The General anticipated your exact maneuvers," Malcolm stated, slapping a printed document face up onto the table. "I have the digital invoice from the commercial locksmith time-stamped precisely on the afternoon of the funeral. I have the signed consignment receipts for the 18th century clocks currently sitting in a holding warehouse in Atlanta. And thanks to the advanced digital monitoring protocols the General quietly installed on the estate's primary servers last year, I have printed copies of the emails Camille sent to a luxury resort developer just 2 days ago, illegally offering to sell protected coastal wetlands." Camille's face drained of all color, turning the sickly pale shade of crushed chalk. Grant slammed his fist against the heavy wood, shouting a string of vicious, desperate curses while attempting to snatch the papers. Evelyn shot up from her leather chair, her vintage purse crashing loudly to the floor, vehemently protesting that the entire document was a fraudulent, manipulative setup. Malcolm did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, nor did he deviate a single inch from the strict legal protocol. He simply spoke over their chaotic, spiraling panic with absolute authority, by the direct documented authority of General Warren Holloway, and due entirely to your own verifiable actions. Every single asset, property deed, and financial trust awarded to you in the primary will is hereby revoked. You receive absolutely nothing." The absolute devastation in the room was palpable. But Malcolm was not finished. He was about to deliver the killing blow. "We will now proceed to the distribution of the non-probate assets held securely within the Holloway Continuance Trust," Malcolm announced, his voice echoing with profound finality. "This trust contains the controlling shares of Breakwater Response Holdings. It contains the deeds to the strategic deep-water ports, the massive municipal bond portfolios, the comprehensive insurance reserves, and the liquid funds specifically allocated for the conversion of 4 commercial motels into emergency housing." Grant stopped breathing. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he finally understood the true staggering scale of the vast wealth Waring had successfully hidden in plain sight. Full executive control of these associated liability companies and 100% of the assets within the Continuance Trust are hereby transferred immediately to Harper Baker as the sole and exclusive heir. Malcolm looked directly at me for the very first time since the reading began. "Furthermore, Harper Baker is officially appointed as the new chairwoman of this entire logistical network. The estate of Bracken Point is transferred into her direct stewardship with explicit instructions and full funding to legally transform the property into the Holloway Anchor Center, a transitional sanctuary for military veterans and families permanently displaced by coastal disasters." He looked back down at the final page to read the General's very last words, penned specifically for the bloodline that had so deeply disappointed him. The message was brutally short. "You learned how to crave. She learned how to carry. I leave the future to the one who understands the true meaning of responsibility." Grant lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of pure rabid denial. "You cannot do this to me!" Grant screamed, completely abandoning his sophisticated corporate polish. "I have a board meeting for Brewater Holdings in less than 24 hours. I will tie this entire estate up in litigation for the next 10 years. I will sell those clocks tomorrow morning to fund the lawsuit." Malcolm calmly placed his silver fountain pen back into its leather holder. "You will do no such thing, Grant. I have already secured a temporary judicial injunction freezing the auction house in Atlanta. The authorities are currently recovering the stolen property. Furthermore, the executive board of Brewater Response Holdings received a certified legal update regarding the official transfer of power exactly 1 hour ago. Your meeting is permanently cancelled. You have absolutely no seat at that table." They were completely, utterly destroyed. They had walked into the law office firmly believing they were untouchable royalty, and they were leaving as trespassers, stripped of every single illusion of power. I did not smile. I did not laugh. and I certainly did not lower myself to hurl petty insults at them. The most devastating revenge I could possibly inflict was to simply exist in the exact space they had so violently tried to deny me. I stood up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my dark jacket, reached across the heavy mahogany table, and accepted the master legal files from Malcolm Sir. I looked at the three of them, observing their shattered egos and their sudden, terrifying poverty. Then I spoke my very first sentence of the entire afternoon. "Please reclaim the house exactly as he intended." I turned my back on them and walked out of the law firm, leaving them to suffocate in the silent, cold room they had foolishly chosen as their battlefield. 6 months later, the heavy iron gates of Bracken Point officially reopened. It was no longer the private exclusive mansion of a greedy, entitled dynasty. The sprawling grounds were alive with the sound of construction crews finishing the structural seam wall and carpentry teams finalizing the new transitional housing units. It had become the Holway Anchor Center, exactly as we had envisioned on that dark, humid night on the back porch. It was a place where people who had lost absolutely everything to the violent storms of the world could find a safe harbor to stand back up without an ounce of humiliation. Evelyn, Grant, and Camille did not go to prison in some dramatic cinematic courtroom climax. Reality is rarely that theatrical. Their punishment was vastly more agonizing. They lost their pristine social reputations, their access to easy credit, and their unearned power within the coastal community. They were forced to quietly sell their luxury vehicles and drastically downsize their lives, forever haunted by the suffocating knowledge that their own vicious, impatient greed had cost them a massive empire. They lost the absolute illusion that a biological bloodline automatically grants a person's supreme worth. I stood alone on the wide wooden veranda of the estate, feeling the heady salty wind sweep across the vibrant green marshland. I held the General's old tarnished brass compass in the palm of my hand. Looking out at the rising tide, I finally understood the profound depth of what Warren Holloway had left behind. He did not build this massive, intricate legal fortress simply to exact petty revenge on his relatives on my behalf. He left me a system. He left me a foundation strong enough to take the bitter, cold contempt I had experienced as a helpless orphan and transform it into a permanent, unshakable home for those who had been violently thrown away by the rest of the world. And as I watched the sun begin to set over the deep water, I knew with absolute certainty that this was the deepest, truest victory of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel. Like this video and support us even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.